The desert doesn't forgive silence. It absorbs it, layer by layer, until the air itself feels heavy with all the things that were never said. In 1950, a small ranch sat alone in the high plains of eastern New Mexico, its fences stretching out like ribs under the sun. The land was vast, the wind constant, and the dust, red and fine, clung to everything that dared to stand still. The Ward Ranch wasn't much to look at, just a clapboard house, a few cattle sheds, and a well too close to the porch. People used to say that nothing really grew out there except loneliness. Evelyn Ward lived on that land with her husband, Frank. They had no children, though you might have thought the house was waiting for one. The curtains were soft and pale. The kitchen always smelled faintly of peaches, and Evelyn's handwriting filled small notes pinned to the pantry wall. Lists, thoughts, sometimes a single word like stay. She had a quiet beauty, the kind that didn't demand attention but held it all the same. Frank worked the cattle, sunburned and wordless, while she kept the house breathing. They weren't rich, but they had each other, and in that corner of New Mexico, that counted for something. Then came the day the wind changed. June 1950. A Thursday that started like any other, clear, dry, and mercilessly still. By evening, Evelyn was gone. When Frank rode back from the North Pasture that afternoon, the house was open. The door swung lightly on its hinge, creaking each time the wind touched it. Inside, a pot of stew simmered half-finished on the stove. A cup of coffee, still warm, rested beside a folded towel. Her apron lay across the chair as if she'd just stepped away for a moment, but she hadn't come back. The chickens were still out. The radio murmured static. Her shoes sat neatly by the door. Frank called for her, once, twice, again. The echo of his voice carried to the empty air, unanswered. There were no footprints beyond the porch, no sign of struggle, no vehicle tracks in the yard. Just the sound of the wind moving through dry grass and a faint, hollow thud of the well cover shifting slightly against the boards. That well had always made Evelyn uneasy. She used to tell neighbors that the water there tasted different, that sometimes when she drew it up, it smelled of iron and earth. Frank thought it was her imagination. But even before she disappeared, she'd started covering it every night, even though no one else went near it. When the sheriff asked later if he'd ever heard anything strange from it, Frank didn't answer right away. He just said, "It's deep," and left it at that. As the sun sank, the horizon turned the color of rust. The air grew colder, heavier. The ranch dogs barked at nothing for hours. By the time night arrived, the Ward house stood dark, one window flickering with lamplight, the rest swallowed by the vastness of the plains. That night, Frank sat on the porch, staring at the well. He didn't move. He didn't call out again. The silence felt like something alive, pressing in from all directions. In the days that followed, people would speak of that evening as if the desert itself had swallowed Evelyn whole. They said the land kept secrets, that sometimes it takes back what was never really ours to begin with. In that part of New Mexico, the earth has a way of holding on to stories. Some are written in the wind. Others, like Evelyn's, settle deep, far beneath the surface, where no one dares to look. And as the night fell over the Ward Ranch, the only sound that remained was the soft rattle of the well's wooden lid, rocking gently in the wind, like something beneath it was breathing. Morning in the desert begins quietly, without hurry or color. The sun doesn't rise so much as it burns to the horizon, setting the sand ablaze with gold light that makes everything shimmer, even the dry bones of fence posts and brittle tufts of grass. That Thursday morning, June 8, 1950, Evelyn Ward woke before the first light reached the windows. She moved carefully through the house, barefoot, as if she didn't want to disturb the stillness that clung to everything. In the kitchen, the clock ticked without rhythm, its second hand sticking every few beats. The air smelled faintly of rain that never came. Evelyn cracked the kitchen window to let in the morning wind. It carried the sound of distant cattle and the creak of the windmill turning slowly, almost reluctantly. She began her usual chores. The rhythm of them was comfort. Feed the chickens, sweep the porch, heat water for Frank's coffee. But something about her seemed off that day, small pauses between motions, like she was trying to remember something she had forgotten in a dream. Neighbors later said she'd been quieter lately, distracted, as though listening to something only she could hear. When she walked the yard, her eyes would drift toward the old well by the porch. That circular mouth in the ground had been there longer than anyone could remember. Some said the well had been dug before the ranch was even built, that its first owner had marked it with a cross before he left. To Evelyn, it was more than superstition. It was presence. She once told a neighbor's wife that the well felt awake, and then laughed it off, embarrassed. But she had stopped drawing water from it weeks before she disappeared. Frank noticed, of course, but chalked it up to her stubborn streak. He didn't know she'd started writing about it in her diary. That morning, after breakfast, Frank saddled his horse to check the northern fence line. The grass was brittle under the hooves, and dust rose behind him like smoke. He told Evelyn he'd be back before evening. She smiled and nodded, standing by the porch in her faded blue dress, the one with the frayed buttons she kept meaning to replace. Her hair was tied up in a scarf, the color of wild sunflowers. When he rode away, he looked back once and saw her hanging laundry, white sheets catching the light like flags in the wind. It was the last time he ever saw her. Around noon, the mail carrier stopped by, a man named Richard Cole, who made the route twice a week from Tucumcari. He would later testify that Evelyn looked cheerful, waving as he handed her a letter from her sister in Arizona. She'd mentioned the heat and laughed when he commented on the ghost wind that sometimes whistled through the canyon. "It's not ghosts," she said. "It's the earth talking." He thought nothing of it then. Inside, Evelyn read her sister's letter, then began writing a reply. Her handwriting that day was slower, more deliberate. She mentioned missing the sound of rain and how the nights had felt crowded, even though she and Frank were alone. At the bottom of the page, she wrote something strange. "The wind hasn't stopped since Monday. It's like it's trying to tell me something, but I can't quite hear." The letter was never mailed. By early afternoon, the sky began to shift. The air grew dry and electric, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, but no storm arrived. The curtains in the kitchen fluttered though the window was closed. Evelyn was last seen by a passing truck driver on the road half a mile from the ranch. He told police he saw her near the clothesline, the white sheet snapping hard in the wind. She was standing still, he said, like she was listening for something. When Frank returned that evening, the house still smelled faintly of stew and soap. The linens were still on the line, stiff from the sun, and the letter she'd been writing lay open on the table beside a half-finished cup of tea. The clock had stopped. Everything was exactly as it had been that morning, except Evelyn was gone. Neighbors came by to help search. They called her name into the gathering dusk, voices echoing across the fields. No one saw movement. No one heard a cry. Just the restless whisper of the wind curling to the dry grass, and the hollow sound of the well cover rattling softly, like something underneath it had shifted. In the following days, people would recall that morning as if it had been warning them all along. The light had been too sharp, the silence too long, the air too still. But hindsight is cruel that way. What no one could have known then was that the world had already started erasing her, slowly, quietly, the same way the desert swallows footprints before the next sunrise. And if you stood there now where the house once stood, you might still hear the sound of fabric moving in the wind, the ghost of white sheets dancing endlessly in the place where she was last seen. By nightfall, word of Evelyn Ward's disappearance had spread across the flatlands faster than the dust storms that used to roll through every spring. Out here, nothing ever happened that didn't become everyone's concern. When Frank rode into town at dusk, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat, people noticed. He spoke few words at the sheriff's office, just that his wife was gone, that she'd been home when he left and wasn't when he came back. The sheriff, an old man named Harlan Price, gathered a few deputies and volunteers and followed Frank back through the dirt road toward the ranch. The stars were already bleeding into the sky, and the desert stretched wide and black around them, silent except for the rhythmic hum of crickets and the uneasy clatter of their horses' hooves on dry ground. When they arrived, the house stood still, a soft glow from a single kerosene lamp leaking to the kitchen window. Everything inside looked untouched. The stew on the stove had cooled to a thin film. A chair had been pulled back from the table, but not tipped, not moved roughly. It was as if Evelyn had simply stepped out of time. Sheriff Price walked the property with a lantern, calling her name in his calm, gravelly tone. "Evelyn Ward," he said into the dark, as though he expected the night to answer. The men fanned out, combing the fields, checking the barn, the feed sheds, the dry creek bed that cut through the back pasture. There were no footprints beyond the porch. The soil was soft enough that even a rabbit left a mark, but there was nothing, no sign she'd walked away, no scuff, no drag, no struggle. Her shoes were by the door, her sun hat still hanging from its hook. The dogs barked for hours, then fell silent, pacing near the well but refusing to go close. When one of the deputies shined his light down into it, all they saw was their own reflection, trembling on the surface of dark water 30 feet below. At dawn, the sheriff called for more help. Dozens of locals came, ranch hands, neighbors, the pastor from town. They searched every inch of land, walking shoulder to shoulder, scanning for clothing, jewelry, anything. They found nothing. A pilot from a nearby airstrip volunteered to fly over the area in a small plane, circling the property for hours. No tracks, no disturbed earth, no glint of movement anywhere. Back at the ranch, Frank sat on the porch steps, his face unreadable, his hand shaking as he rolled a cigarette he never lit. When the sheriff asked if they'd argued, he shook his head. "She was fine this morning," he said quietly. "She said she'd bake bread." The sheriff studied him a long while, noting the lack of tears, the way his eyes kept drifting to the well. "Mr. Ward," he said finally, "when was the last time you spoke to your wife?" Frank didn't answer right away. Then, almost too softly, he said, "When I left, she was singing." By the second day, rumors began to weave their way through town. Some said she'd run away with someone, though no one could name who. Others whispered darker things, the kind people only say when they think no one will repeat them. They said maybe Frank had done something, that his quietness wasn't grief but guilt. The sheriff didn't believe that, not entirely, but he had seen men break in stranger ways. He searched the house again, room by room, and noticed something odd. The bed was still made, perfectly smooth, but one of Evelyn's dresses, a pale one with floral stitching, was missing. Everything else of hers remained. Over the following week, state police joined the search. They drained the nearby stock pond, combed the arroyos, and brought in bloodhounds from Albuquerque. The dogs sniffed Evelyn's clothing, her hairbrush, the towel on the porch rail. They followed a scent that led briefly toward the well, then stopped cold. One of the handlers said the dog started whining, tail between its legs, refusing to move closer. They tried again. Same reaction. The sheriff dismissed it, telling the men that animals pick up on nerves, not ghosts. Still, when they lowered a light into the well, the beam shimmered on still water and reflected back nothing but blackness. Newspapers picked up the story a week later. Ranch wife vanishes without trace. Authorities baffled. They printed Evelyn's photo, her soft smile, her eyes almost luminous in the grayscale. Reporters came from Santa Fe and Amarillo, snapping pictures of the barren land and the lonely ranch that now looked like a stage missing its actors. Frank refused interviews. He worked the land by day and sat on the porch by night, waiting, as though he expected her to walk back up the path at any moment. Months later, when the sheriff spoke of it, he said something that never left him. It wasn't just that she was gone. It was like the world rearranged itself around the fact she'd never been there at all. The desert, vast and unyielding, had swallowed her whole, leaving behind no witness, no trace, not even a reason. In the end, they filed the paperwork the way they always did. Missing person, presumed dead. But people in town didn't speak of Evelyn as lost. They said she'd been taken, not by a man, not by fate, but by the land itself. Because out there, where the wind never stops and the ground keeps its own secrets, disappearance is an event. It's a return. And on quiet nights, when the wind shifted just right across the plains, the old sheriff swore you could still hear something faint and hollow echoing from that well, like a whisper that never reached the surface. After the first winter passed, the official search for Evelyn Ward had ended, but the eyes of the small town never stopped watching her husband. Out on that stretch of sunburned earth, gossip traveled faster than any car could drive to the people in Tucumcari. Frank Ward had become a figure both pitied and feared, A man left alone with too much silence. The papers had printed his face enough times that even children whispered his name when trucks rumbled down the dirt road that led to the ranch. He stopped going into town altogether. The feed store began delivering his supplies at the gate, and the mail carrier left letters without knocking. No one wanted to see the look in his eyes anymore. When deputies came by to ask more questions, Frank answered with quiet patience, his voice steady but hollow, as if the words were being drawn from somewhere far below him. He told them the same story over and over. He left in the morning, came home that afternoon, and she was gone. He didn't cry. He didn't get angry. He didn't swear to prove his innocence. He simply said he didn't know. To the sheriff, that calm was unsettling. He'd seen men weep, shout, and beg for help, but Frank's stillness unnerved him. "You act like you've already buried her," Sheriff Price said once. Frank looked up, his eyes tired, and replied softly, "Maybe I have." That was the last real conversation they had. After that, the sheriff came only when the state asked for updates, and Frank said less each time. Inside the house, dust gathered on surfaces that Evelyn used to keep spotless. Her sewing table remained untouched. Thread still looped through the needle, the pattern she'd been working on pinned in place, as if she might walk in any minute to finish it. Her scent lingered in the hallway, a faint trace of soap and cedar. Frank couldn't bring himself to move anything, couldn't sleep in their bed, so he began sleeping on the couch, where he could keep one ear turned toward the porch. Some nights he swore he heard footsteps, soft, careful ones, moving just outside the door. When he looked, there was only wind stirring the dust. Reporters came and went, snapping pictures of the old ranch and its silent owner. They asked questions meant to provoke him, whether he and Evelyn had fought, whether he'd ever thought about leaving. "We were happy," he said once, his voice cracking for the first time. "She just stopped being here." The journalist wrote that line in italics in the newspaper, as though it carried a hidden confession. Neighbors remembered Evelyn as gentle and kind, always humming when she worked in her garden. They also remembered how, in the months before she vanished, she'd started keeping to herself. She'd asked strange questions about wells, about how far sound could travel underground, about whether people could dream of places they'd never been. Frank never mentioned those conversations. He told the sheriff he thought she was just restless, maybe lonely. The ranch had a way of wearing people down. Then came the discovery of the letter. It was late September when one of the deputies returned to collect remaining personal items for her sister, Martha. In a drawer near the bedroom window, beneath a folded stack of linens, the deputy found an unfinished letter addressed to Martha herself. It wasn't dated, but the handwriting was steady and deliberate. In it, Evelyn wrote about the hum she couldn't explain. "It comes from the ground at night," she had written, "and sometimes if I stand by the well long enough, it sounds like a heartbeat." The letter ended mid-sentence, the last line reading, "There's something in the ground I can't stop hearing." When the sheriff showed the note to Frank, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said, "She used to talk like that when she couldn't sleep." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a cigarette, but he didn't light it. "She wasn't crazy," he whispered. "She just listened too closely." The sheriff didn't know what to make of that. He took the letter for evidence, but it was never added to the official file. Too strange, too vague. Still, it began to haunt those who'd read it. The well, once just a piece of farm equipment, now carried a quiet menace in everyone's mind. People said Frank had started visiting it late at night, lantern in hand, just standing there in silence. Others said they'd seen him talking to it. He denied it, but there were nights when a faint glow could be seen across the field, the yellow flicker of his lamp swaying beside the well until dawn. As the seasons turned, the ranch itself began to decay. The windmill blades stopped spinning. The fences leaned. Weeds pushed through cracks in the porch steps. It was as if the land had decided to reclaim what was left of the wards. Frank rarely left the property. When he did, he moved slowly, like someone walking through a dream he couldn't wake from. The few who spoke with him said his voice grew softer with time, until it was almost a whisper. He talked less about finding Evelyn, and more about understanding her. Once, when the pastor stopped by, Frank asked a strange question. Do you think the earth remembers us after we're gone? The pastor didn't know how to answer. Loneliness can hollow a man in ways no one sees. The townsfolk said Frank Ward was a ghost long before he died, living between two silences, the one before she vanished and the one that followed. The desert didn't change, but Frank did. His grief wasn't loud. It didn't rage or plead. It settled deep and quiet, like sediment at the bottom of a well. And some nights, if the wind carried right, people swore they could hear something faint coming from the Ward Ranch, like a man murmuring to himself, or maybe to someone that was listening beneath the ground. By late autumn, the Ward Ranch had begun to look like a place the world had decided to forget. The wind had sanded the fences down to gray splinters, and the grass no longer grew near the well. What once looked like the heart of the property now seemed like an open wound, dark, silent, and bottomless. People driving past on the dirt road said the air felt heavier when they approached the ranch. The place had started to breathe differently, as though something beneath it was alive. It had been 4 months since Evelyn vanished, and Frank Ward had retreated completely into himself. The sheriff stopped checking in. Neighbors left groceries at the gate and drove away without speaking. The ranch was quieter than ever, except for one thing. Sometimes, at night, the wind carried a sound that no one could explain. It started with a hired hand, a drifter named Jonas who had taken a temporary job helping Frank mend the southern fence. Jonas slept in the barn to avoid the oppressive silence of the house. On his second night, he heard something, a low, rhythmic hum coming from the direction of the well. At first, he thought it was the wind cutting through the boards, but it carried a strange pitch, almost melodic. He said later it sounded like a woman humming to herself, the kind of tune you hum when you think no one is listening. The next morning, Jonas told Frank. Frank didn't react, didn't even look up from his coffee. He just said, "You'll get used to it." That was the last day Jonas stayed. By sunset, he was gone, walking back toward town without collecting his pay. He told the sheriff, "It wasn't the kind of sound a man forgets." When word spread to the small towns nearby, people began to talk about the well again. They said Evelyn's spirit lingered there, trying to speak, try to be found. Others claimed it wasn't her at all, that the land itself was restless, punishing those who disturbed it. The older folk whispered about the first settlers who dug wells in that part of New Mexico, and how they sometimes struck pockets of air that sang when wind passed over them. But no one could explain why the sound began only after she vanished. Sheriff Price, still uneasy about the case, ordered 2 men to return to the ranch to examine the well. The cover was pried open, and ropes were fixed to a pulley as they lowered a lantern down. The flames swayed gently in the blackness, reflecting off damp stones. The light reached the water 30 feet below, calm, undisturbed. The air that rose from it smelled of metal and something else, old, stale, and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. One of the deputies claimed he heard the humming again when the lantern stopped swinging. The other swore it was just the echo of the wind through the opening. Sheriff Price ended the inspection quickly. "Seal again," he said. "Nothing good comes from chasing what isn't there." But when they replaced the cover, Frank stepped forward, staring into the hole before it closed. "Don't," he said, voice trembling for the first time anyone had heard. "She's down there." That night, he stayed by the well with a lantern until dawn. From that day on, he refused to let anyone near it. He nailed the cover shut, wrapped in wire, and kept the only key. But even then, he couldn't stay away. Each night, after the sky faded to violet and the coyotes started calling in the distance, he'd unlock it again. Sometimes neighbors driving by would see a flicker of light on the horizon, the orange glow of Frank's lamp swaying gently above the earth's mouth. He began writing letters no one ever received. They were found later, stuffed into a drawer, written in the same careful hand as his old ranch records. The letters were addressed to Evelyn, though they read more like confessions. In one, he wrote, "You said it was under us that the ground was hollowing. I should have listened. The wind isn't just wind anymore. It has a voice now, and it calls your name." In another, he wrote, "I hear it too. Sometimes it sounds like water, sometimes like breathing. Sometimes I think it's just me. But then the dogs start whining, and I know I'm not alone." Those letters were never mailed, never signed. Some ended abruptly, The ink smudged as if by tears or rain. By winter, Frank's isolation deepened into something feverish. He stopped eating regular meals, started sleeping in a chair beside the window, facing the well. When neighbors dared approach, they said he looked thinner, eyes sunken, hands stained with oil from the lantern. He barely spoke. Once, when a rancher named Luke tried to offer help, Frank only said, "She's waiting. The ground isn't done." The humming continued, not every night, but often enough that even skeptics began to avoid the ranch after dark. Those who passed by said they sometimes saw faint ripples in the soil around the well, as if something beneath it shifted. The sheriff wanted to seal it for good, to fill it with concrete, but the county lacked funds and interest. If he wants to live with it, the sheriff muttered, let him. And so the well remained open, guarded by a man half ghost and half memory. That winter, when the cold finally crept in and the wind turned sharp, Frank stopped lighting the lantern. The ranch stayed dark for nights on end. Then, one morning, a neighbor driving past claimed to see him kneeling by the well, head bowed, whispering. The wind carried his voice, faint and cracked. "I hear you, Evie. I hear you." No one knows what he heard that night, or if he heard anything at all. But from then on, when the wind blew hard across the plains, even the toughest ranch hands swore it carried a note of music, soft, low, and unbearably sad. And those who had known Evelyn Ward said it sounded just like her. It was late autumn when Evelyn's sister, Martha, finally made the journey to the Ward Ranch. The news of Evelyn's disappearance had traveled slowly through Arizona, and by the time Martha arrived, months had passed. She drove along the dusty road with her car windows down, letting the chill of the high plains creep into the cabin. The ranch came into view, a lonely silhouette against the fading light, its fences leaning, the windmill still. The air smelled faintly of rainless earth, dust, and something older, harder place, the scent of absence. Frank met her at the gate, his face thinner, more drawn than she remembered. His hands were calloused, rough from months of work. He didn't seem to notice. He offered little greeting, just a nod, and gestured toward the house. Inside, the place was untouched, preserved in a time that had already passed. The kitchen counters were swept clean, but the half-finished stew from that day remained in the corner, cold and unremarkable. Sunlight slanted through the windows, catching the motes of dust that hung like tiny stars. As Martha moved through the house collecting what belonged to her sister, she noticed a slight draft in the barn. The wooden floorboards groaned under her feet as she inspected the loft. That's when she saw it, a small, weathered box tucked beneath a floorboard near the hay. At first, she thought it might be an old tool chest, but the weight was lighter. When she pried it open, she found a diary, Evelyn's own handwriting spilling across yellowed pages, perfectly preserved despite the months of dust. The entries began ordinarily, a recounting of daily life on the ranch, chores, weather, letters sent and received. But as Martha flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. Evelyn wrote of feeling restless, of the wind carrying voices she couldn't understand. She wrote of standing near the well, listening for hours, convinced it was alive in some inexplicable way. It hummed sometimes, one page read. Sometimes it's like a heartbeat, but not mine. It's below, and I can feel it calling. Other entries were more fragmented, less coherent, but they revealed something deeper. Fear, curiosity, obsession. Evelyn described dreams where the earth beneath the ranch opened up, revealing hidden chambers filled with light and shadow. She saw figures in those dreams, a small child silhouette, a woman she didn't recognize, whispering to her, guiding her to something she didn't yet understand. One passage read, "I think someone is waiting the ground, someone who has always been waiting. I hear them, sometimes, and I wonder if I should answer." The diary suggested that Evelyn had been more aware than anyone realized, more attuned to the land and its secrets. She wrote of her ancestors, of women who had lived and vanished before her, and how the land seemed to repeat their stories. One particularly chilling entry described her fascination with the well, how she dug around it quietly, alone, checking for signs of what might lie beneath. She seemed to believe that the answers she sought were hidden there, something her family had buried, intentionally or by accident, long ago. Martha couldn't help but feel a shiver as she read. The diary was filled with Evelyn's voice, her thoughts, her fears, yet it hinted at something beyond human understanding. The entries blurred the line between reality and dream. There were sketches, small drawings of the well, and symbols she didn't recognize, spirals and circles that seemed to map the movements of something beneath the earth. The more Martha read, the more she realized that her sister's disappearance was not just a matter of absence. It was a result of an obsession that had consumed her. Frank said nothing as Martha examined the diary. He sat in a chair by the window, staring out at the barren fields, hands folded, jaw tight. He didn't look at the pages, didn't comment. But later, when Martha was ready to leave, he quietly said she was listening too closely. She heard what others couldn't. His voice was low, almost reverent, and there was a tremor of fear beneath the calm he tried to present. The diary would later become the centerpiece of the mystery. Scholars, investigators, and neighbors who read it after the fact noted how prescient some of Evelyn's writings were, how her fears and observations mirrored strange occurrences reported by those who came to the ranch in later years. She seemed to sense something fundamental about the well, a hidden depth, a presence, a history that no one else had noticed. And in the quiet of the abandoned ranch, with dust settling on the wooden floors and the wind whispering through cracks in the walls, it felt as though Evelyn herself was still there, her voice lingering in the air, urging someone to understand what the earth had kept hidden all along. The diary revealed not just a missing person, but the mind of someone who had glimpsed something deeper, something that connected the living to the land in ways no one could explain. It painted a portrait of a woman caught between curiosity and dread, between the ordinary life she knew and the mysteries that waited beneath the surface, patient and unyielding, as if the earth itself had chosen her as its confidant. Martha left the ranch that evening carrying the diary in her hands. The sky above was a vast canvas of indigo and violet, stars beginning to prick through the darkness. As she drove away, she glanced back at the house and the well, its cover still in place, and felt a weight she couldn't name. Whatever had taken her sister, whatever had called to her from below, remained silent and unmoving, waiting for the next soul willing or compelled to listen. And for the first time, Martha understood, Evelyn had not simply vanished. She had uncovered something that had always been there, buried beneath the soil, beneath generations of silence, waiting to be remembered. Winter settled over the high plains like a thick, unyielding blanket, turning the Ward Ranch into a place that seemed almost abandoned by the sun. Snow dusted the fences and rooftops in quiet, uneven patches, and the wind howled through the empty fields with a voice that carried both warning and sorrow. The air was brittle, cold enough to make the eyes water, yet the ranch held a stillness that no storm could break. By this point, Evelyn had been gone for months, and Frank Ward's isolation had deepened into something almost tangible, like a shadow that clung to the house and moved with it across the frozen land. The neighbors hardly spoke to him anymore. Deliveries were left at the gate. Anyone approaching the porch would catch only a glimpse of his figure, hunched and still, staring at the horizon or the well as though expecting it to answer him. Even those who had known Frank for years admitted to feeling an unease when passing the property. The snow muffled all sound, except for the occasional creak of a board or the faint rustle of distant wildlife. At night, some said they could see a single light flicker at the well and a shape kneeling beside it. Others claimed it was only a trick of the wind against the lantern's flame. Frank's days became a repetition of ritual rather than labor. He shoveled snow from the porch, fed the few remaining animals, and kept the house from succumbing entirely to dust and decay. But it was at night that he was most alive in a way that unsettled those who watched from afar. Each evening, he would light a lantern and approach the well, kneeling beside it, muttering words no one could hear. He refused to let anyone near, warning them simply, "She's still here." Sometimes he would lower the lantern into the black mouth of the well, letting it sway in the cold night air and wait. Wait for what? No one could say. The few who dared speak with him noted that his voice had changed, soft, almost musical at times, carrying a quality of mourning and awe at once. He talked less about searching for Evelyn and more about understanding her, as though she had become part of the land itself. He spoke of listening to the wind and hearing her footsteps in it, of feeling her presence in the earth around the house. At times, he even referred to the well as if it were sentient, responding to him, holding her, or at least echoing her memory back to him. The ranch itself reflected the slow unraveling of its owner. Roof shingles loosened and fell. Fences sagged, and weeds pushed up through the snow-matted grass. The house, once orderly and warm, took on the appearance of a relic, a vessel for absence and memory. Visitors noted the silence inside, a silence that was not merely the lack of sound, but a presence in itself, heavy and almost palpable. It pressed against the walls and filled the rooms, as if the earth beneath the ranch was holding its breath. In those quiet months, Frank rarely left the property. When he did, it was only to gather supplies or check on his livestock, and he moved slowly, deliberately, as if traveling through a dream. Those who passed him on the road described him as a man suspended in time, a shadow among shadows, carrying grief so deep it seemed inseparable from the winter itself. Yet even in this oppressive stillness, Frank's attachment to the well grew stronger. He cleaned the wooden cover each day, polished the metal rim, and occasionally pried it open to peer inside, though he never spoke of what he expected to see. The townsfolk began to whisper again, now not only about Evelyn's disappearance, but about Frank's behavior. They said he had become a man talking to ghosts, that the sound of the wind through the well had taken hold of him. Some nights, travelers reported seeing him sitting beside the well, lantern in hand, rocking slightly as though swaying to an unseen rhythm. He would whisper words that no one could hear clearly, sometimes her name, sometimes a soft lullaby. The wind carried faint echoes of these sounds across the frozen plains, and even those in town miles away reported feeling uneasy, as if a presence had followed them from the ranch. The winter dragged on, and with it came a slowing of the world around the Ward Ranch. Time seemed suspended there, a place where day and night blurred, and where the earth held its secrets tightly. Yet Frank remained vigilant, tethered to the well, as though some unseen bond had been forged between him and the absence of his wife. He did not leave, he did not sleep through the night, and he did not speak to anyone unless necessary. His life had become a vigil, an endurance of longing and fear entwined. Even as the snow melted in early spring, leaving behind brittle grass and soggy soil, the legend of Frank and the well persisted. Locals whisper the man who refused to abandon hope, of a figure kneeling beside the well in the cold, and of sounds low, melodic, impossibly human, that seemed to rise from the depths. They said he was listening to her, or perhaps listening with her, as though the earth itself had a memory, and Frank had become its keeper. By the end of winter, it was clear to everyone that something had changed at the Ward Ranch. The land had absorbed Evelyn's absence, Frank's grief, and the murmurs of the well into its own being. It was no longer just a place of work or home. It had become a shrine, a waiting room, a site where silence was not empty, but full, heavy with expectation. And through it all, Frank Ward remained tethered to a memory, kneeling beside the well, refusing to leave, guarding a secret that only he, or perhaps the earth beneath him, could know. Spring brought a restless energy to the plains around the Ward Ranch, yet the land itself seemed reluctant to awaken. The snow melted into pale mud, and the wind carried the scent of damp earth, sharp and metallic, as if the soil remembered every secret it had swallowed. Frank Ward moved through this reborn world with the same slow, deliberate steps he had taken all winter, but now his actions seemed more ritual than necessity. Each morning, he tended to the cattle. Each afternoon, he repaired the sagging fences, and each night he returned to the well, kneeling beside it as though some invisible tether drew him there. Visitors were few, and those who came brought only questions, curiosity, and whispers. Reporters from Albuquerque and Santa Fe arrived, drawn by the enduring mystery of Evelyn's disappearance. They brought cameras and notebooks, hoping to capture evidence of something unusual. Frank allowed them to photograph the ranch from a distance, but no one was permitted near the house or the well. In interviews, he spoke little, his voice steady yet hollow, the words measured. "She's not gone," he said once to a persistent journalist. "She's waiting down there." The reporter had no idea what to make of it, and neither did anyone else. It was during this period that the strange occurrences intensified. Those living on neighboring ranches began reporting unusual sounds carried by the wind, low hums, faint enough to be mistaken for the murmurs of the earth, but with a cadence and pitch that suggested intent. Animals grew restless. Dogs howled at night. Horses refused to enter their stables, and flocks of birds circled the ranch in tight formations, as if drawn to something unseen. One farmer claimed that when he passed the Ward Ranch at dawn, he saw Frank standing by the well, arms outstretched, face tilted toward the sky, murmuring words that no human could decipher. Inside the house, the air remained unchanged, as if frozen the moment Evelyn disappeared. Dust settled in slow patterns, untouched yet somehow deliberate. Visitors who dared to enter reported an oppressive quiet, a stillness that weighed on the chest and blurred perception of time. Frank had begun leaving small items near the well. Candles, scraps of paper, even a single apple, offerings to the unseen force he believed lingered there. It was a strange devotion, neither religious nor entirely sane, but revealed the depth of his conviction and the pull the well exerted over him. By mid-spring, word of the War Ranch's strange phenomena had reached the ears of folklorists and paranormal enthusiasts. They came in small groups, notebooks in hand, cameras set on tripods, hoping to witness the inexplicable. They reported subtle changes in the landscape, soil that seemed softer near the well, faint impressions in the dirt that disappeared by morning, and occasional glimpses of movement that could not be attributed to wind or wildlife. Frank welcomed no one. He would stand guard at the well, lantern in hand, and silently gesture them away, speaking only in quiet warnings. This is not for you. She waits, and she waits alone. Amid these events, the town's memory of Evelyn transformed. She became less a woman lost and more a spectral presence tethered to the earth, a figure both mourned and feared. Locals spoke of her as she still moved through the fields, her voice carried by the wind, her silhouette glimpsed at dawn or dusk. Martha, Evelyn's sister, returned briefly, drawn by a mixture of grief and curiosity. She walked the empty rooms of the house, ran her fingers over the furniture that had not been disturbed since her sister vanished, and read aloud passages from the diary she had recovered months prior. With each word, it was as if the ranch itself responded. The wind would shift, dust motes would swirl in erratic patterns, and the faint hum near the well seemed to grow stronger. Frank began documenting these occurrences in his own journal. The pages were filled with meticulous notes, observations of sound, light, and animal behavior, sketches of the well, and fragments of conversations he imagined with Evelyn. He wrote of sensing her presence beneath the surface, of hearing her voice in the rush of the wind, of feeling her near the edge of consciousness when the world was quietest. These entries were a testament to his obsessive need to understand what had happened, to map a mystery that defied reason. The well, central to everything, grew in prominence and dread. Frank no longer merely watched it. He listened. He described moments when the water itself seemed to pulse, sending vibrations through the earth that mirrored the rhythm of a heartbeat. He wrote of seeing shapes beneath the surface, shadows that shifted independently of light. At night, he would sit for hours beside it, leaning his ear close, whispering names, phrases, and questions, recording responses only he could interpret. The wider community began to accept the ranch as a site of quiet terror. Travelers and nearby ranchers avoided it after dark. Children dared not run along the road at dusk, claiming that the ground talks when the wind passes through. Frank's behavior, though increasingly erratic, was no longer considered strange in the context of the land's own uncanny atmosphere. The Ward Ranch had become a nexus of mystery, a place where human curiosity and natural emptiness collided in a tension that refused to resolve. By the end of spring, the first hints of summer's heat stirred the plains, and with it came an even deeper restlessness. The hum from the well seemed to intensify, animals became more unpredictable, and Frank's nightly vigils grew longer. No one could say for certain what he experienced in those hours, but those who observed from a distance spoke of a man transformed, part sentinel, part mourner, bound to the earth and the secrets it held. And beneath it all, the story of Evelyn Ward continued to echo, a voice lost, a presence remembered, a mystery that the land itself seemed determined to keep. By early summer, the Ward Ranch had become a place of whispers and shadow. The once quiet high plains now seemed charged, as though the earth itself remembered Evelyn Ward and refused to release her memory. Travelers along the dirt roads reported the same unsettling sensations. The wind shifting suddenly, carrying faint murmurs that seemed human, shadows that moved against the light, and a peculiar heaviness in the air that made the skin crawl. Those who knew Frank Ward spoke in hushed tones, describing him as a man no longer entirely of this world, someone tethered to the well, to the earth beneath it, and to a voice only he could hear. Frank's isolation had intensified. He no longer left the property, except to check on livestock. His interactions with the outside world had dwindled to nothing more than brief exchanges over fence lines, or from his porch, voice low and careful. Inside the house, dust settled over surfaces undisturbed since Evelyn disappeared. Personal effects, notes, and letters remained exactly where she left them, as though the world had paused the moment she vanished. He kept meticulous journals now, pages filled with diagrams of the well, observations of the wind, sketches of shapes he claimed to see beneath the water, and fragmented recollections of his conversations with Evelyn's memory. The townspeople began to see Frank's obsession as something larger than grief. On some nights, the hum from the well seemed almost audible beyond the ranch boundaries, carried by the heat of summer air. Livestock would grow restless. Barking dogs would refuse to return to their pens, and even wild animals that had once roamed freely seemed hesitant near the property. Some locals swore that the well itself vibrated faintly at night, like the rhythm of a slow, distant heartbeat. Frank spoke of the sounds to no one but himself, recording each one in detail in his journals. He described tones that shifted with the wind, the way the hum sometimes resembled a lullaby, other times a call to something below the surface. He sketched diagrams of the earth beneath the well, marking out circles and lines and patterns that he believed connected to her presence. In one entry he wrote, "I know she waits there. She isn't lost. The ground holds her, and I must understand it before it takes more." One summer evening, a neighbor named Clara, who had once delivered milk to the ranch, came by to check on Frank. She found him kneeling at the edge of the well, lantern in hand, muttering softly to something invisible. Dust swirled around him, caught in the lantern's glow. He didn't notice her at first, entirely consumed by his vigil. When she called out, he only raised a finger in warning and whispered, "She hears me." Clara left quickly, shaken, later telling the sheriff that she had seen Frank speaking to the earth itself. Stories of strange occurrences multiplied. Travelers reported seeing lights flickering near the well late at night. Shadows moved independently of wind and trees. Horses stamped their feet, and dogs barked in patterns no human could decipher. People began to say that Evelyn's presence lingered in the air, a force tethered to well, and that Frank had become a mediator between the living and whatever lay beneath. Martha, Evelyn's sister, returned again that summer, determined to understand her sister's disappearance. She walked the familiar rooms of the house, noting every detail preserved exactly as Evelyn had left it. The diary, which had been stored safely, revealed new entries that had been missed before, fragments of thought that hinted at Evelyn's growing obsession with the well and the strange hum she sometimes heard from below. She wrote of feeling pulled toward it, of dreams in which she descended into darkness and glimpsed shapes moving in shadow. These passages suggested that Evelyn had discovered something beyond human understanding, something hidden beneath the ranch that called to her mind and imagination alike. Frank spoke little to Martha, but she observed him for hours beside the well. He moved with reverence, speaking in whispers, sketching in the dirt, and occasionally lowering the lantern into the dark water, while muttering fragments of sentences she could not hear. He believed, she realized, that the well was not merely a hole in the earth, but a doorway, a threshold between the known and the unseen. By the end of summer, the legend of the Ward Ranch had grown. Locals no longer referred to Evelyn's disappearance as simply a missing person case. They spoke instead of the hum, the restless land, the man kneeling at the well, and the strange lights that flickered at night. The ranch had become a nexus, a place where grief, obsession, and something inexplicable coexisted. Frank himself seemed caught between two worlds, one grounded in memory and the mundane tasks of ranch life, the other drawn inexorably to the mysteries below the well. His journals, his sketches, and his whispered conversations chronicled a descent into a singular fixation. He believed that Evelyn had not simply vanished, but had become part of the earth itself, and that it was his duty to maintain the connection. And so the ranch continued to exist as it had for months, a solitary outpost in the high plains where the sun beat down relentlessly by day. The wind carried secrets by night, and the earth seemed alive with a presence no one could touch but all could sense. It was a place where time slowed, where memory and obsession intertwined, and where Evelyn Ward remained forever part of the land that had swallowed her whole. By late summer, the Ward Ranch had taken on a reputation that stretched far beyond its immediate neighbors. The story of Evelyn Ward's disappearance, intertwined with the strange phenomena surrounding the well, became something of a whispered legend across the county. Travelers passing along the dirt roads told of the isolated house, the solitary man kneeling beside the well at night, and the low hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Locals called it the Whispering Ranch, a name that carried both awe and fear, as though the land itself was alive with memory and warning. Frank Ward's days had become more rigid, ritualized, and relentless. Each morning he tended to the animals, moved feed, and repaired fences, but his mind was never on the labor at hand. Instead, he measured time by the sun's movement across the sky, marking hours not in tasks completed, but in moments that could bring him closer to Evelyn, or to what he believed remained of her beneath the earth. At night, he would approach the well, lantern in hand, kneeling for hours, listening and speaking to something unseen. He no longer slept in the house. The couch had become his bed, positioned to give him the closest possible access to the well. The intensity of Frank's obsession affected those who ventured near. Neighbors reported feeling a strange heaviness when approaching the ranch after dusk, an almost physical pressure in the air, as if the land itself rejected intrusion. Animals grew restless and unpredictable. Dogs howled without cause, horses refused to enter their stables, and flocks of birds would circle above, restless and erratic. Even the wind seemed different near the well, carrying a tone that was subtle, persistent, and impossible to ignore. It was during this time that Frank began documenting his experiences with increasing rigor. His journals were filled with diagrams, sketches, and detailed observations of sound, movement, and light. He mapped the contours of the land, the position of the well, and the patterns he believed connected to Evelyn's presence. He wrote in fragmented sentences, alternating between meticulous observation and confessional musings. One entry read, "The hum grows stronger in the heat of late afternoon. It vibrates in the soil. I can feel it through my knees. She is there, waiting. I must not leave her alone." Visitors continued to arrive, drawn by rumor, curiosity, or the hope of witnessing the inexplicable. Frank allowed none near the house or well, warning simply, "This is not for you. She waits." Some stayed on the road, observing from a distance, and reported seeing a single light flicker beside the well into the night. Shadows moved across the field, and occasionally a figure could be glimpsed kneeling, whispering words carried away by the wind. The hum itself seemed to respond to intrusions, swelling, then receding, almost as though it were aware of their presence. Martha returned again during this period, armed with Evelyn's diary and a determination to understand. She walked the house, noting the careful preservation of every detail. Dust lay undisturbed. Furniture, curtains, and personal items remained exactly as they had been the day Evelyn disappeared. Reading aloud from the diary, she noticed the wind outside shift, the dust motes caught in sunlight swirl unusually, and faint vibrations rise from the ground beneath her feet. It was as though the ranch itself responded to the memory of Evelyn, acknowledging her sister's presence while remaining opaque, unyielding, and alive. Frank confided little to Martha, but she observed him for hours at the well. He moved with a reverent precision, lowering the lantern into the darkness, murmuring phrases she could not hear. He spoke of shapes beneath the water, of subtle movements in the soil, of responses from the earth itself. In his eyes, the well was no longer simply a man-made structure, but a living entity, a repository of memory and presence. "She is there," he said once, voice low, reverent, "and I must listen." The well became central to everything, both in Frank's mind and in the rumors that had begun to spread beyond the immediate community. It was described as a place where the hum rose strongest, where vibrations could be felt in the earth, and even in one's chest. Shadows shifted at the edges of perception. Some claimed to have glimpsed shapes in the water's reflection, though none could describe them with certainty. It was no longer just a site of disappearance. It had become a locus of obsession, memory, and mystery. By the end of the summer, the Ward Ranch was more than a home. It was a living monument to Evelyn Ward and the enigma of her disappearance. Frank had become the guardian of a secret that belonged as much to the land as to his lost wife. The earth beneath the well seemed to pulse with a rhythm that mirrored his own heartbeat, a silent testament to what had been taken, what had been left, and what might never be understood. And through it all, the story of Evelyn lingered, not merely as a missing person, but as a presence woven into the soil, the wind, and the hearts of those who dared to approach the whispering ranch. Every glance at the well, every nightfall, every whisper wind seemed to ask the same question: what lies beneath, and is it calling to us, or are we calling to it? By early autumn, the Ward Ranch had taken on an almost mythic quality, a place where reality and legend blurred. The disappearance of Evelyn Ward, once a story confined to whispered conversations in Tucumcari and Albuquerque, had evolved into something larger, an enduring mystery whispered along highways and across county lines. Travelers spoke of the solitary ranch, the man kneeling by the well as twilight fell, and the faint hum that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth. For those who approached too closely, the ranch was a place of unease, a site where the wind carried a voice not entirely human, and the soil seemed to remember its own hidden histories. Frank Ward himself had transformed with the seasons. His thin, weathered frame moved with the precision of someone caught between grief and ritual. Each day was devoted to a meticulous maintenance of the ranch and its surroundings, yet his mind was anchored entirely to the well. The lantern he carried every night was both a guide and a talisman, its glow tracing the contours of the land as he knelt beside the yawning darkness below. Visitors, few and cautious, reported seeing him whispering softly, hands tracing invisible patterns in the air, as if conducting a silent dialogue with something unseen. The phenomena surrounding the well intensified. Neighbors claimed to hear faint whispers carried across the fields at night, a rhythmic hum that seemed almost melodic, punctuated by sudden spikes of sound like a pulse or heartbeat. Dogs refused to enter the property after dusk. Horses shied violently when near the boundary. Even wildlife seemed drawn to the area, circling overhead and vanishing abruptly. Those who ventured near spoke of shadows that shifted independently of the wind and of an oppressive weight in the air, a stillness that pressed against the chest and demanded attention. Frank chronicled these events with increasing detail. His journals overflowed with observations of sound, movement, and light, diagrams of the land, and sketches of patterns he believed connected to Evelyn's presence beneath the well. He wrote of the hum's rhythms and its variations, sometimes gentle, sometimes insistent, and of how he believed the vibrations traveled through the earth to him alone. One entry read, "It grows louder when the sun dips. I feel in my bones a pulse that matches hers, or perhaps mine, or perhaps both. I am listening, and she is here." Martha returned once again, carrying the diary and her own questions. She walked through the house, noting the careful preservation of each object. Dust lay undisturbed on counters. Furniture remained perfectly aligned. Threads hung from the sewing table exactly as Evelyn had left them. Reading aloud, she noticed subtle changes in the air, a shift in the wind, a faint resonance that seemed to come from below the well. The earth itself responded to Evelyn's memory, acknowledging her sister's presence with something like recognition, a subtle vibration underfoot that defied explanation. Even as the legend grew, Frank's obsession deepened. He spent hours each night kneeling beside the well, lowering the lantern, tracing patterns in the dirt, whispering phrases only he could interpret. He spoke of shapes beneath the water, of subtle movements in the soil, and of the hum as a language, one he was attempting to decode. "She is there," he would murmur, eyes fixed on the darkness, "and I must listen. She cannot be left alone." The wider world began to take notice. Scholars and journalists came, drawn by reports of strange occurrences, but none were permitted near the well. Frank warned them simply, "It is not for you. She waits." Some claimed to witness a glow that shifted with the hum, as if the very earth itself responded to the unseen presence. Shadows danced across the snowmelt and summer grass alike, and vibrations in the soil seemed to carry an urgency that human understanding could not grasp. By late autumn, the Ward Ranch had become a nexus, a place where grief, obsession, and the inexplicable intersected. Evelyn Ward's disappearance was no longer simply a missing person case. It had evolved into a presence, a memory woven into the earth, the wind, and the consciousness of those who dared observe. Frank had become both guardian and participant, a man tethered to a secret that the land itself seemed determined to preserve. The well, central to everything, grew ever more menacing and magnetic. Frank's nightly vigils became longer, sometimes lasting until dawn. He would lower the lantern into the dark water and remain silent, whispering, listening, recording subtle changes in light, sound, and vibration. The rhythm of the hum seemed to intensify, almost conversational, as if the earth responded to his devotion. In his journals, he sketched patterns that suggested a hidden geometry beneath the surface, symbols and spirals that spoke to something older than the ranch, older than the land itself. Locals continued to avoid the property after dusk. Travelers reported glimpses of a man kneeling beside a lantern, the air vibrating faintly around him, shadows moving against the moonlight. Some claimed they could hear the hum even from a distance, carried on the wind like a memory. The story of Evelyn Ward became intertwined with the land, inseparable from the ranch, the well, and the man who refused to leave. Frank Ward existed in this liminal space between past and present, human and land, grief and understanding. Every movement, every whispered phrase, every careful observation was a testament to his obsession and devotion. He was no longer merely a man mourning his wife. He was a sentinel, listening to the voice beneath the soil, responding to it, and maintaining a connection that defied reason. And so the Ward Ranch remained, a place apart, a locus of mystery and devotion. The well waited, Evelyn waited, and Frank Ward, kneeling night after night, bound himself to the land and its secrets, living in a world where absence had weight and memory had the power to shape reality. As winter approached once more, the Ward Ranch seemed to shrink into itself, the plains around becoming muted, brittle, and inhospitable. The cycles of the seasons, spring's restless energy, summer's oppressive heat, and autumn's lingering melancholy, had done little to alter the essence of the place. It remained a nexus of grief, obsession, and unexplainable phenomena, a locus where the earth itself seemed to breathe in rhythms imperceptible to most, yet vivid and urgent to one man, Frank Ward. Frank's devotion to the well had become absolute. Every waking moment outside of tending to the animals and maintaining the dilapidated structures was spent beside it, lantern in hand, kneeling or crouching, listening to the faint hum that no one else could hear. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones, a solitary figure moving across the frost-covered fields at dawn and dusk, the small glow of his lantern flickering like a heartbeat in the darkness. They called him a ghost, a sentinel, a man caught between the living world and something buried beneath it. He had become meticulous in his observations, recording every sound, every shift in the air, every subtle movement in the water or soil near the well. His journals now spanned dozens of volumes, each page densely filled with diagrams, sketches, and musings that blended the line between careful study and fevered obsession. Some entries read like scientific notes. Others were almost poetic, meditative, or desperate. One passage stated, "The hum rises when the wind turns northeast. The water responds. She is there and I hear her. If I leave, she will be lost again." Animals that once grazed contentedly on the property had become extensions of the land's strange rhythm. Dogs refused to leave the house. Horses shied violently at the edges of the field. Even birds, those fleeting observers of the human world, circled above the well in tight, unnatural formations before vanishing as if called elsewhere. Frank seemed attuned to these subtle shifts, recording their movements alongside the vibrations he felt beneath his knees. Every behavior, every nuance, was a piece of a larger puzzle he alone could perceive. Visitors continued to appear sporadically, journalists, folklorists, and curious townsfolk, but none were permitted near the well. Frank's warnings were soft but firm. It is not for you. She waits, and she must not be disturbed. Those who lingered at a distance reported strange phenomena, flickers of light that seemed to respond to unseen movement, shadows that danced against the terrain in ways inconsistent with the wind, and the ever-present hum, faint yet persistent, rising and falling like a living heartbeat beneath the earth. Martha returned again that winter, armed with Evelyn's diary and a determination to understand. Walking through the house, she noted the meticulous preservation of every object and surface. Dust settled in precise patterns. Curtains hung as they had months before. Threads remained looped through needles, the sewing projects untouched. Reading aloud, she felt the subtle responses of the land, a faint vibration to the floorboards, a shift in the wind, a sense of attention emanating from the well itself. It was as though the earth acknowledged her presence, recognizing someone tied by blood to Evelyn, yet unwilling to reveal all its secrets. Frank's nocturnal rituals had intensified. He would sit for hours beside the well, lowering the lantern into the darkness, tracing invisible patterns in the air, whispering words that seemed both familiar and unknowable. He spoke of shadows beneath the water, movements in the soil, and a voice that responded to him, answering in tones only he could decipher. Each night was a vigil, each whisper a tether connecting him to Evelyn, or to the presence that had claimed her. One evening, his journal recorded, the pulse rises as the moon drifts across the sky. She is moving beneath. I listen. I wait. I am here for her. The well itself had become a symbol, a vessel, and a mystery. Those who dared speak of it described it as alive, a place where the hum carried intention, where vibrations traveled through the earth to touch the living. Local folklore merged with Frank's experiences, and the ranch became more than a site of disappearance. It was a threshold, a junction between the known world and something hidden, vast, and patient beneath the soil. As winter deepened, the legend grew. Travelers avoided the ranch after dusk. Those who passed during the day spoke of an air that seemed heavier near the property, charged with expectation and memory. Children whispered about the man who spoke to the well, who knelt by it in silence, who listened to voices they could not hear. Frank, for his part, existed in a state that balanced on the edge of human comprehension. He was neither entirely of the living world nor fully consumed by what lay beneath, but tethered to both, caught in a cycle of vigilance, devotion, and obsession. The Ward Ranch, by this time, had become a place where absence had weight. Every shadow, every sound, every subtle shift in the wind or earth carried meaning. Frank Ward was a man who had given himself entirely to that meaning, who had become part of the landscape in a way no one else could. And beneath it all, the hum persisted, the well waited, and the memory of Evelyn Ward remained patient, unyielding, and alive in a way that defied both time and human understanding. Winter nights grew long and silent, and yet the ranch throbbed with the pulse of the unseen. Frank remained beside the well, listening, watching, documenting, speaking softly to the darkness. The earth beneath him seemed to answer, carrying secrets and echoes of a presence that would not leave. And in that silence, the story of Evelyn Ward, the woman who vanished into the earth, leaving behind only questions, memory, and a hum, continued timeless, haunting, and unresolved.